There have been 5 moments in the history of the Earth when life on this planet came close to ending. Not metaphorically close. Not the kind of close that allows for comfortable reassurance. Close in the way that a fire comes close to consuming a house when the walls are already burning and the roof has already fallen in. In each of those 5 moments, the diversity of life on Earth, the extraordinary accumulation of billions of years of evolutionary experimentation, was reduced by a fraction so large that the surviving lineages were not the triumphant winners of a competition but the accidental remnants of a catastrophe. The word extinction is familiar. It appears in the news regularly, attached to species disappearing at rates that biologists find alarming. But a mass extinction is something different in kind from the ordinary background rate of species disappearance that has always characterized the history of life. A mass extinction is an event in which the background rate of extinction is exceeded by such a large factor, over such a relatively short period of time, that the structure of ecosystems is fundamentally disrupted, major lineages are eliminated, and the subsequent history of life takes a direction that could not have been predicted from the trajectory it was on before the event. Mass extinctions are not just the loss of species. They are the resetting of evolutionary trajectories, the erasure of possibilities, and the creation of new opportunities in the ecological space left empty by the vanished lineages. Subscribe now so you are here for the next journey. Every week, a new documentary built for the hours before sleep, calm and detailed, always going further than you expect. The 5 great mass extinctions of the Phanerozoic Eon, the half-billion years of multicellular animal life that followed the Cambrian explosion, are known by their geological boundaries. The end-Ordovician extinction, approximately 443 million years ago. The late Devonian extinction, approximately 372 million years ago. The end-Permian extinction, approximately 252 million years ago. The end-Triassic extinction, approximately 201 million years ago. And the end-Cretaceous extinction, 66 million years ago. Each of those events eliminated more than 75% of the species alive at the time. Some eliminated far more. The end-Permian extinction, which paleontologists call the Great Dying, is estimated to have eliminated between 90 and 96% of all marine species and approximately 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species. A loss so catastrophic that it fundamentally reorganized the structure of life on Earth and required approximately 10 million years for ecosystems to recover to anything approaching their previous complexity. The story of those 5 events is a story about the mechanisms by which the Earth systems can be destabilized, by volcanic eruptions of a scale we have never witnessed, by collisions with objects from space, by changes in ocean chemistry and ocean circulation that propagate through ecosystems in cascading ways. But it is also a story about survival, about the improbable persistence of lineages through conditions that were lethal to the vast majority of their contemporaries. And it is, ultimately, a story about us, because every living thing on Earth today, including every human being, is a descendant of the survivors of those 5 near-total catastrophes. The concept of the Big 5 mass extinctions was formalized in 1982 when paleontologists Jack Sepkoski and David Ropp published a comprehensive analysis of the marine fossil record that identified 5 episodes of elevated extinction rates standing out clearly above the background noise of continuous low-level extinction. That analysis, which drew on a database of thousands of marine genera compiled by Sepkoski over a decade of painstaking bibliographic work, transformed the study of mass extinctions from a descriptive enterprise focused on individual events into a quantitative science capable of comparing the magnitude, duration, and selectivity of different extinction events. The Big 5 framework that emerged from that work has been refined by subsequent analyses, but has remained the fundamental organizing structure of mass extinction research for more than 4 decades. The first of the 5 great mass extinctions occurred at the end of the Ordovician period, approximately 443 million years ago, and it is in some ways the most puzzling of the five. The Ordovician was one of the most biologically rich periods in the history of the ocean. The Cambrian explosion had, by the mid-Ordovician, diversified into an extraordinary array of marine animal forms, trilobites in hundreds of species, brachiopods filtering plankton from every available substrate, graptolites floating in their colonial structures through the open ocean, nautiloid cephalopods hunting with their long tentacles in the shallow seas. Coral reefs had appeared for the first time, building the kind of complex three-dimensional structures that shelter and concentrate biodiversity. The Ordovician Sea was, by any measure, one of the most productively diverse environments in the history of life. Then, in what was geologically a brief interval of perhaps a few 100,000 years, approximately 85% of marine species disappeared. The ocean acidification associated with the end-Permian and end-Cretaceous mass extinctions has received increasing scientific attention in recent decades, partly because of the parallel it offers to the current human-driven acidification of the ocean. The dissolution of carbon dioxide in seawater produces carbonic acid, which dissociates to release hydrogen ions that lower the pH of the water and that react with calcium carbonate minerals, dissolving the shells and skeletons of the organisms that depend on those minerals. The most vulnerable organisms in periods of ocean acidification are those with thick calcified shells or skeletons, including corals, brachiopods, echinoderms, and many mollusks. The selective elimination of those organisms during the end-Permian and end-Cretaceous events is consistent with the pattern of marine extinctions documented in the fossil record, and it provides a direct analogy with the current ocean acidification that is being driven by the dissolution of human-emitted carbon dioxide. The mechanism of the end-Ordovician extinction is still debated among paleontologists, but the most widely accepted model involves two separate pulses of extinction driven by different but related causes. The first pulse is associated with a major glaciation that began approximately 445 million years ago, when the supercontinent Gondwana drifted over the South Pole and ice sheets accumulated across its surface. That glaciation lowered global sea levels by approximately 100 meters as water was locked in the growing ice sheets, draining the shallow epicontinental seas where most marine life lived. The cold water that filled those shallow seas where they persisted was poor in the warm, nutrient-rich conditions that the diverse Ordovician fauna required. The second pulse of extinction occurred when the glaciation ended, as rapidly as it had begun. The melting of the Gondwanan ice sheet raised sea levels again, flooding the continental shelves with warm water. That rapid warming, following a brief and severe cold period, created conditions of oxygen deficiency and chemical change in the ocean that eliminated the organisms that had survived the initial glaciation. The double pulse of extinction, first cold then warm, first low sea level then high, was more effective at eliminating diversity than either cause alone would have been. The survivors of the end-Ordovician extinction were organisms with wide geographic distributions, those that had managed to spread across enough of the ocean to find refugia where local conditions allowed persistence. They were organisms with generalist diets and broad environmental tolerances, able to survive on whatever food sources remained during the disruption. And they were organisms with life histories that included resistant stages, eggs or cysts or spores capable of surviving unfavorable conditions until the environment improved. Those characteristics, generalism, broad tolerance, and resistant life stages, would prove to be the hallmark of survivors across all five mass extinctions. The late Devonian extinction is the most complex and most extended of the five, occupying a period of environmental instability that lasted approximately 20 million years, between approximately 375 and 359 million years ago. The trilobites, which survived the end-Ordovician extinction and continued to be abundant and diverse through the Silurian and Devonian, represent one of the most successful evolutionary experiments in the history of animal life. They appeared in the early Cambrian approximately 520 million years ago and persisted for more than 250 million years, diversifying into thousands of species that exploited virtually every marine habitat from the shallowest reef to the deepest abyssal plain. Their segmented bodies, compound eyes, and sophisticated respiratory systems were so successful that the basic trilobite body plan was maintained with relatively little modification across the entire history of the group. The end-Permian extinction finally eliminated them after they had survived the end-Ordovician and the late Devonian, and the oceans of the Triassic and all subsequent periods were trilobite-free for the first time since the early Cambrian. Their 300-million-year reign as one of the dominant groups of marine invertebrates is a testament to the effectiveness of the arthropod body plan in marine environments. The Devonian period was the age of fish. The first jawed fish had diversified explosively during the Silurian and Devonian into an extraordinary variety of forms, including the heavily armored placoderms that dominated the Devonian seas as the top predators, the lobe-finned fish from which the first terrestrial vertebrates would eventually evolve, and the first sharks and ray-finned fish that would eventually become the dominant vertebrates of modern oceans. The Devonian was also the period when plants first colonized the land in a serious way, transitioning from low-growing ground-hugging forms to true forests with tall trees, deep root systems, and complex wood chemistry. That colonization of the land by plants was itself one of the likely contributors to the late Devonian extinction, through a mechanism that is both elegant and brutal in its logic. The deep root systems of the first true trees penetrated the soil and began to break down the underlying rock in a process of enhanced chemical weathering that had not previously existed on land. That weathering removed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at a rate far faster than the pre-forest weathering processes had achieved. As carbon dioxide levels fell, the global climate cooled significantly, and the warm shallow seas of the Devonian, which had been some of the most biologically productive environments in the history of the ocean, experienced a progressive loss of warmth, light, and oxygen that drove species after species to extinction. The loss of the placoderms is one of the most significant outcomes of the late Devonian extinction. Those heavily armored fish, which had been the dominant predators of the Devonian seas for more than 50 million years and which had diversified into hundreds of species ranging from tiny bottom dwellers to the enormous Dunkleistos, nearly 6 meters long and with one of the most powerful bites of any vertebrate that ever lived, disappeared entirely. Not a single placoderm species survived the Devonian extinction. The group that had dominated the vertebrate world for tens of millions of years was completely eliminated, leaving behind only the fossil record of their extraordinary diversity. The survivors of the late Devonian extinction were predominantly the ancestors of the modern vertebrate groups. The sharks, which survived in small numbers and diversified dramatically afterward. The ray-finned fish, which were minor members of the Devonian fauna but became the dominant vertebrates of all subsequent oceans, and the lobe-finned fish, specifically a small lineage that had developed the ability to use its fins to move on land and that, in the succeeding Carboniferous period, gave rise to the first truly terrestrial vertebrates. The extinction of the placoderms cleared the ecological stage for those groups, allowing them to diversify into the roles that the placoderms had vacated and in so doing to produce the vertebrate fauna that would characterize all subsequent periods of Earth history. The end-Permian extinction, which occurred approximately 252 million years ago, is the largest and most catastrophic mass extinction in the history of complex life. The numbers are almost too large to absorb. Approximately 90 to 96% of all marine species became extinct. Approximately 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species disappeared. Entire ecological structures that had persisted for hundreds of millions of years were dismantled in an interval that may have been as short as 60,000 years. The ocean ecosystems that had been building in complexity since the Cambrian explosion were reduced to a fraction of their former diversity. The terrestrial ecosystems that had developed during the Carboniferous and Permian were stripped of most of their vertebrate fauna. The fate of the ammonites through the 5 mass extinctions provides a microcosm of the broader story of survival and extinction across geological time. Ammonites, The coiled cephalopods that are among the most distinctive and most studied of all fossil organisms first appeared in the Devonian and survived the late Devonian extinction, though reduced to a small number of species. They survived the end-Permian extinction with only a single lineage persisting, the ancestor of all subsequent ammonite diversity, which subsequently diversified explosively during the Triassic into hundreds of species. Those Triassic ammonites were again severely reduced by the end-Triassic extinction but once more recovered, diversifying through the Jurassic and Cretaceous into the most spectacular array of forms in the group's history. And then, at the end of the Cretaceous, the entire lineage was finally eliminated. The ammonites had survived 3 of the 5 great mass extinctions through a combination of luck, wide geographic distribution, and life histories that included planktonic larval stages capable of dispersing across ocean basins. The 4th time they encountered a mass extinction, the end-Cretaceous, they were finally unlucky. The cause of the end-Permian extinction is now understood with reasonable confidence, though the details of the mechanisms involved are still being refined. The primary driver was the eruption of the Siberian Traps, a massive volcanic province in what is now Siberia, that released an estimated 3 million cubic kilometers of lava over a period of approximately 1 million years. That eruption, which was one of the largest volcanic events in Earth history, injected enormous quantities of carbon dioxide, methane, and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, triggering a greenhouse warming that raised global temperatures by approximately 10 degrees Celsius. It also triggered ocean acidification as the additional carbon dioxide dissolved in seawater, producing carbonic acid that dissolved the calcium carbonate shells of marine invertebrates and disrupted the chemistry of the marine food chain from its base upward. The graptolites, colonial organisms that floated through the Ordovician and Silurian oceans in their millions, are among the most useful fossils known to paleontologists because of the speed at which they evolved and the precision with which their evolutionary changes can be traced in the fossil record. Different graptolite species are characteristic of specific geological time intervals, and their fossils allow stratigraphers to correlate rocks deposited in different parts of the world with a precision of hundreds of thousands of years. The mass extinction at the end of the Ordovician eliminated most graptolite species, but a small number of survivors diversified into the new ecological space of the early Silurian, producing a post-extinction graptolite fauna that eventually achieved a diversity comparable to that of the Ordovician. That recovery, though incomplete by the Devonian when the last graptolites finally disappeared, illustrates the general pattern of extinction followed by diversification that characterizes the aftermath of all the major events. The ocean anoxia that accompanied the warming was perhaps the most immediate cause of the marine extinctions. As the ocean warmed, its ability to hold dissolved oxygen decreased, and the stratification of the ocean into oxygenated surface water and anoxic deep water intensified. The boundaries of those anoxic zones expanded, encroaching on the shallow shelf environments where most marine life lived and creating kill zones that eliminated species that could not tolerate low oxygen levels. The sulfur isotope record in the rocks of the end-Permian boundary shows the widespread presence of hydrogen sulfide in the ocean, a product of bacterial metabolism in anoxic conditions that is toxic to most aerobic organisms and that may have risen into the atmosphere in concentrations sufficient to damage the ozone layer and intensify the ultraviolet radiation reaching the surface. The survivors of the Great Dying were predominantly small-bodied, metabolically flexible, and ecologically generalist organisms. Among marine animals, the bivalves, which had been a relatively minor component of Permian marine communities, survived and subsequently diversified explosively to become the dominant filter feeders of Mesozoic and modern seas. The conodonts, enigmatic eel-like organisms that had been common in Paleozoic oceans, survived but subsequently became extinct in the following Triassic period. And a small number of lineages from virtually every major animal group survived, though often reduced to single or very few species, providing the genetic raw material from which the eventual recovery of marine diversity would be built. The recovery from the end-Permian extinction was extraordinarily slow. The initial diversification of survivors in the earliest Triassic produced low-diversity communities dominated by a small number of opportunistic species, a pattern called the disaster fauna that lasted for approximately 5 million years. Full recovery of ecosystem complexity, as measured by species richness, body size diversity, and the complexity of ecological interactions, took approximately 10 million years, and some researchers argue that the full ecological complexity of the pre-extinction world was not recovered until the Jurassic period, approximately 30 million years after the extinction itself. The end-Triassic extinction, which occurred approximately 201 million years ago, is in some ways the least understood and most underappreciated of the 5 great mass extinctions. It eliminated approximately 76% of all species, making it comparable in magnitude to the end-Ordovician and late Devonian events. But because it followed the end-Permian extinction by only 50 million years, and because the Triassic fauna that it eliminated was in many ways still rebuilding from the devastation of the Great Dying, the end-Triassic extinction receives less scientific and public attention than the events that bracket it. The organisms that disappeared in the end-Triassic extinction were, in many cases, evolutionary experiments that had diversified during the Triassic recovery from the Permian catastrophe and that never had the opportunity to develop the full ecological complexity that had characterized the Permian world they replaced. The cause of the end-Triassic extinction is now attributed with reasonable confidence to another massive volcanic event, the eruption of the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, a vast volcanic province that was emplaced as the supercontinent Pangaea began to rift apart along what would become the Atlantic Ocean. The eruption released carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in quantities comparable to the Siberian Traps eruption that caused the end-Permian extinction, triggering a warming event and ocean acidification that disrupted marine and terrestrial ecosystems across the world. The coral reefs of the Triassic were among the most significant casualties of the end-Triassic extinction. Those reefs, built by scleractinian corals that had diversified during the Triassic recovery from the Permian extinction, were devastated by the combination of warming and acidification that accompanied the volcanic eruption. The collapse of those reef ecosystems eliminated hundreds of species that depended on the reef structure for habitat and food. The recovery of coral reefs after the end-Triassic extinction took more than 10 million years, and the reef ecosystems that eventually developed in the Jurassic had a significantly different ecological structure from those of the Triassic. The plant fossil record during the late Devonian extinction tells a story that is different in important ways from the animal fossil record. While the marine fauna was experiencing its multi-million-year decline, the terrestrial plants of the Devonian were actually diversifying and expanding their ecological range, with the first true forests appearing in the fossil record approximately 385 million years ago. That ecological expansion of forests was itself one of the causes of the marine extinctions, through the mechanism of carbon dioxide drawdown and associated cooling. The plants were, in a sense, inadvertent participants in an extinction that they both caused and survived, establishing the terrestrial ecosystems that would persist and diversify throughout the subsequent Carboniferous period while the marine world they had helped to devastate was slowly rebuilding. The most consequential outcome of the end-Triassic extinction was its effect on the competitive balance between the dinosaurs and their rivals. The Triassic terrestrial fauna was dominated not by dinosaurs but by a diverse array of cruritarsans, the archosaur group that also gave rise to the crocodilians, and by various groups of dicynodonts and other synapsids that were the descendants of the dominant Permian fauna. Dinosaurs had appeared during the Triassic but were a relatively minor component of most Triassic ecosystems, confined primarily to smaller ecological roles by the diversity and abundance of their cruritarsan competitors. The end-Triassic extinction eliminated most of the cruritarsan groups, leaving ecological space that the dinosaurs were able to fill during the subsequent Jurassic period. The age of dinosaurs, in a very real sense, was made possible by the end-Triassic extinction, which cleared the stage for their subsequent dominance. The question of what role cosmic factors play in the timing of mass extinctions has been debated since the 1980s, when Ropp and Sepkoski proposed that mass extinctions showed a periodicity of approximately 26 million years, suggesting a regular astronomical forcing. Various mechanisms were proposed to explain that periodicity, including a hypothetical companion star to the Sun that periodically perturbed the Oort cloud and sent a shower of comets toward the inner solar system, and oscillations of the solar system through the galactic plane that might expose it to higher rates of cosmic ray bombardment or interstellar dust. Those hypotheses have not been confirmed by subsequent data, and the evidence for a regular periodicity in mass extinctions has weakened as the geological record has been refined. But the end-Cretaceous impact demonstrates that cosmic factors do sometimes play a role in extinction events, and the possible contribution of impact events to other mass extinctions remains an active area of research. The end-Cretaceous extinction, 66 million years ago, is the most studied and the most famous of the 5 great mass extinctions, because it eliminated the non-avian dinosaurs and because the evidence for its cause is the most dramatic and the most directly interpretable. On the afternoon of what would have been, in human calendar terms, approximately 66 million years ago, an asteroid approximately 10 to 15 kilometers in diameter struck the Earth at approximately 20 kilometers per second at the location that is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, creating the Chicxulub impact crater approximately 180 kilometers in diameter and releasing energy equivalent to approximately 1 billion nuclear weapons. The immediate effects were apocalyptic in the most literal sense. The impact vaporized millions of cubic kilometers of rock and water, creating a fireball that spread ejecta across the entire Earth, ignited wildfires across much of the planet's land surface, and sent a colossal tsunami across the Gulf of Mexico and beyond. But the immediate effects of the impact, devastating as they were not the primary cause of the mass extinction. The extinction was primarily caused by what happened in the months and years that followed the impact. The injection of enormous quantities of soot and dust into the upper atmosphere, where they blocked sunlight and caused a global winter that lasted for years. Photosynthesis was severely reduced across the entire surface of the Earth. Plants died. The animals that depended on plants died. The animals that depended on those animals died. The ecosystem collapse propagated through the food web from the base upward, eliminating species at every trophic level in a cascading failure that was as comprehensive as any in the history of life. The evidence for the Chicxulub impact is preserved in a thin layer of clay at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary that is found on every continent and in many ocean sediment cores around the world. That clay layer is enriched in iridium, an element that is extremely rare in the Earth's crust but that is found in higher concentrations in extraterrestrial material. The iridium anomaly, first discovered in 1980 by Luis Alvarez and his colleagues, was the key piece of evidence that established the impact hypothesis on a firm scientific footing, transforming what had been a speculative suggestion into a compelling and eventually overwhelming case. The dinosaurs that survived the end-Cretaceous extinction were the birds, the lineage of theropod dinosaurs that had acquired feathers and flight during the Mesozoic and that proved adaptable enough to persist through the extinction event. The non-avian dinosaurs, which had dominated terrestrial ecosystems for approximately 165 million years, disappeared within a geological instant. The mammals, which had been small, nocturnal, and ecologically marginal throughout the Mesozoic, survived the extinction and diversified rapidly in the Paleogene, filling the ecological roles vacated by the non-avian dinosaurs and eventually producing the extraordinary diversity of mammalian forms that characterizes the modern world, including the primates from which human beings descended. The patterns that emerge from comparing the 5 great mass extinctions reveal important principles about the conditions under which mass extinctions occur and about the characteristics that allow lineages to survive them. The Siberian Traps eruption that caused the end-Permian extinction represents a scale of volcanic activity that is essentially impossible to visualize from human experience. The lava flows of the Siberian Traps cover an area of approximately 2 million square kilometers, roughly the size of Greenland, and in some areas reach thicknesses of 3 to 4 kilometers. The volume of lava erupted is estimated at approximately 3 million cubic kilometers, more than enough to cover the entire surface of the Earth in a layer of solid rock several meters thick. That eruption occurred over approximately 1 million years, meaning that the average rate of lava production was 3 cubic kilometers per year. For comparison, the largest volcanic eruptions in the historical record, events like the 1815 eruption of Tambora in Indonesia, produced approximately 50 cubic kilometers of material in a single event. The Siberian Traps eruption was not a single event of that scale, but a continuous process sustained at similar intensities for an unimaginably long period. The most striking pattern is the role of carbon cycling disruption in triggering mass extinctions. 3 of the 5 events, the end-Permian, the end-Triassic, and possibly the end-Cretaceous, involved rapid releases of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere on timescales of thousands to tens of thousands of years, triggering warming, ocean acidification, and oxygen depletion that were lethal to the majority of marine and terrestrial species. The end-Ordovician involved the opposite, a rapid removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by enhanced weathering, triggering cooling and glaciation. Only the late Devonian extinction involved a more complex and extended disruption that does not fit neatly into either the carbon release or the carbon removal framework. The rapidity of the environmental change is as important as its magnitude. Life can adapt to gradual changes in temperature, ocean chemistry, and atmospheric composition through natural selection over generations. What mass extinctions demonstrate is that when the rate of environmental change exceeds the rate at which natural selection can produce adaptive responses, even highly successful and broadly distributed lineages can be eliminated. The volcanic eruptions that caused the end-Permian and end-Triassic extinctions changed the global environment faster than the evolutionary process could respond, creating a mismatch between the environmental tolerances of existing organisms and the conditions they encountered. The selectivity of mass extinctions is another important pattern. Mass extinctions do not eliminate species randomly. They preferentially eliminate organisms with narrow environmental tolerances, large body sizes, low reproductive rates, restricted geographic distributions, and specialized ecological roles. The organisms most likely to survive mass extinctions are those with wide distributions that allow them to find refugia where local conditions are less extreme, high reproductive rates that allow rapid population recovery after the catastrophe, broad ecological diets that allow them to exploit whatever food sources remain, and physiological flexibility that allows them to tolerate a wider range of temperatures and chemical conditions. Those selective patterns explain why the survivors of mass extinctions are often the small, the generalist, and the ecologically flexible. The large, specialized, and ecologically dominant organisms of the pre-extinction world are most likely to be eliminated, because their success before the extinction is precisely what makes them vulnerable. They have evolved to exploit the specific conditions of the pre-extinction environment, and when those conditions are disrupted, they have nowhere to go. The small, flexible, and generalist organisms that survived in the margins of the pre-extinction ecosystems find themselves, after the catastrophe, in a world where the dominant lineages have been eliminated and where the ecological opportunities previously monopolized by those lineages are now available for colonization. The recovery of coral reefs after each mass extinction provides a particularly sensitive indicator of the time required for ecosystems to rebuild their structural complexity. Coral reefs are among the most complex and diverse ecosystems on Earth, and their recovery after mass extinctions has been studied in detail through the fossil record of reef-building organisms across the geological boundaries. After the end-Permian extinction, reef ecosystems did not recover for approximately 8 to 10 million years, one of the longest reef gaps in the geological record. After the end-Cretaceous extinction, reef communities began recovering relatively quickly, in part because the coral groups that survived the extinction were already well adapted to the post-extinction conditions and were able to expand rapidly into the vacated reef substrate. Those differences in recovery time reflect the different intensities of the two extinctions and the different states of the reef ecosystem at the time of each event. The recovery of life after each of the 5 mass extinctions is as fascinating as the extinction itself, and in many ways more instructive about the long-term trajectory of the history of life on Earth. The pattern of recovery is broadly consistent across the 5 events. In the immediate aftermath of each mass extinction, the surviving communities are dominated by a small number of opportunistic species that are capable of rapid population growth and that exploit the ecological space opened by the extinction. Those disaster faunas and disaster floras are low in diversity but high in abundance, representing the biological equivalent of the first plants to colonize a burned landscape. The species that dominate them are often generalists with high reproductive rates, the same characteristics that allowed them to survive the extinction in the first place. Over the succeeding millions of years, those initial survivors diversify into the ecological space they have colonized. New species arise through natural selection as the populations adapt to the new conditions of the post-extinction world. Ecological interactions between species become more complex as the diversity of the community increases, and new evolutionary experiments are attempted as lineages explore the ecological opportunities that were not available to them before the extinction eliminated their competitors. The end-Triassic extinction left behind one of the most evocative fossil records of any mass extinction, because the fossil beds immediately predating the extinction are so rich and diverse that the contrast with the impoverished post-extinction communities is particularly stark. The limestone formations of the Triassic Alps, particularly those exposed in the Dolomites of northern Italy and in the Austrian Alps, contain some of the most spectacularly diverse reef ecosystems in the geological record. Complex three-dimensional reef structures built by scleractinian corals, sponges, and algae, inhabited by a diverse fauna of ammonites, bivalves, fish, and marine reptiles. The transition from those rich reef communities to the depauperate earliest Jurassic fauna is preserved in sections throughout the Alps and can be traced with a precision that gives the extinction a vividness and a concreteness that the geological record rarely achieves. Those new evolutionary experiments are often the most consequential outcome of mass extinctions, because they produce the lineages that will define life in the subsequent geological period. The mammals that diversified after the end-Cretaceous extinction were not the same kinds of small nocturnal insectivores that had survived the extinction. They diversified rapidly into a vast array of ecological roles, producing the whales, the bats, the horses, the elephants, and eventually the primates that gave rise to human beings. The ray-finned fish that diversified after the late Devonian extinction eventually became the dominant vertebrates of the world's oceans. The bivalves that diversified after the end-Permian extinction became the filter feeders of all subsequent marine ecosystems. In each case, the post-extinction diversification produced a biological world that was more diverse and more ecologically complex than the world that preceded the extinction, at least in some dimensions. This does not mean that mass extinctions are good for life in any meaningful sense. The diversity and complexity of the pre-extinction world represented hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary experiment that was lost, and the organisms that were eliminated had their own intrinsic value independent of any contribution to post-extinction diversity. But it does mean that mass extinctions are not simply endings. They are also beginnings, forced restarts that open the history of life to possibilities that the existing ecological order would have foreclosed. The evolutionary history of the vertebrates provides the clearest illustration of that principle. The vertebrate lineage has passed through all 5 of the great mass extinctions, losing the vast majority of its diversity in each one and subsequently recovering and diversifying into new ecological roles. The vertebrates of the early Ordovician were jawless filter feeders. After the end-Ordovician extinction, the jawed fish diversified. After the late Devonian, the lobe-finned fish evolved into the first terrestrial vertebrates. After the end-Permian, the synapsids that had dominated the Permian were replaced by the archosaurs and eventually the dinosaurs. After the end-Cretaceous, the dinosaurs gave way to the mammals. At each step, the extinction of the dominant lineage cleared the stage for the diversification of the lineage that would define the next chapter of vertebrate history. The question of whether we are currently living through a sixth mass extinction is one that biologists and paleontologists have been debating with increasing urgency since the 1980s. The evidence for elevated extinction rates in the modern period is substantial. The current rate of species extinction is estimated by various methods to be between 100 and 1,000 times higher than the background rate of extinction documented in the fossil record for the Cenozoic. Many of the most iconic animal groups, including amphibians, freshwater fish, and large mammals, are experiencing extinction rates that, if sustained, would eliminate a large fraction of their species within centuries. The extinction of the large megafauna of Australia, the Americas, and many Pacific islands, which occurred in the wake of human arrival at different times over the last 50,000 years, represents a loss of ecological diversity comparable in scale to some of the smaller mass extinction events in the geological record. The comparison between the current extinction crisis and the 5 great mass extinctions of the Phanerozoic is complicated by several factors. The 5 great mass extinctions are defined by events in the fossil record, and the fossil record preserves species over geological timescales in a way that allows the calculation of extinction rates with a temporal resolution of thousands to millions of years. The current extinction crisis is occurring on a timescale of decades to centuries, which is far shorter than the temporal resolution of the fossil record, making direct comparisons of extinction rates between the current period and past geological events inherently uncertain. What is clear is that the drivers of the current extinction crisis, habitat destruction, overexploitation, invasive species, pollution, and climate change, are removing species from the planet at rates that, if they continue for centuries, would produce an event in the geological record comparable to the 5 great mass extinctions. The organisms most at risk in the current extinction crisis share the same characteristics as those most vulnerable to past mass extinctions: large body size, slow reproductive rates, narrow geographic distributions, specialized ecological roles, and dependence on specific environmental conditions that are being altered by human activity. The role of evolutionary innovation in the recovery from mass extinctions is a topic that has attracted increasing attention from evolutionary biologists studying the post-extinction radiations. Each mass extinction creates ecological opportunities that had not previously existed, and the lineages that survive to exploit those opportunities often produce evolutionary innovations, new body plans, new ecological strategies, and new biochemical capabilities that would not have developed in the ecological context of the pre-extinction world. The evolution of powered flight in birds and bats during the Cenozoic, the evolution of complex social behavior in insects and mammals, and the evolution of language and technology in hominins are all examples of evolutionary innovations that occurred in the ecological space created, directly or indirectly, by previous mass extinctions. Understanding the relationship between extinction events and subsequent evolutionary innovation is one of the most productive frontiers in the study of the history of life. The diversification of mammals after the end-Cretaceous extinction is one of the most rapid and most spectacular evolutionary radiations in the history of life. Within approximately 10 million years of the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs, the mammals had diversified from their small insectivore-like Cretaceous ancestors into an extraordinary variety of ecological roles and body plans. Herbivores ranging from small rodent-like forms to large browsing ungulates, carnivores from small weasel-like predators to large bear-like hunters, insectivores, frugivores, aquatic specialists, and the first representatives of the distinctly mammalian lineages that would eventually become the whales, the bats, the elephants, and the primates. That radiation was made possible by the ecological space opened by the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs and the other large Cretaceous reptiles, and it demonstrates the capacity of life to exploit evolutionary opportunities with extraordinary rapidity when those opportunities arise. The philosophical implications of that comparison are difficult to face directly. The 5 great mass extinctions were caused by geological and astronomical forces that operated independently of any choice. Volcanic eruptions, orbital perturbations, asteroid impacts, and glaciation. The current extinction crisis is being caused by the choices of a single species, choices about how to organize economic activity, how to manage land, how to use the atmosphere as a waste sink, and how to govern the exploitation of natural resources. That the causal agency is human rather than geological does not make the extinction less real or the loss less permanent. Extinct species do not recover. The evolutionary experiments they represented do not restart. The ecological roles they filled are left empty for timescales measured in millions of years. The 5 mass extinctions also provide a perspective on the concept of deep time that is worth sitting with, because the timescales involved are ones that the human mind struggles to internalize. The end-Permian extinction occurred 252 million years ago. Between that event and the present, the following things have happened. The dinosaurs appeared, diversified, dominated terrestrial ecosystems for 165 million years, and were eliminated. The mammals appeared, diversified, and produced the entire range of mammalian forms from bats to whales. The Atlantic Ocean opened. The Himalayas were built by the collision of India with Asia. Antarctica moved to its current position and acquired its ice sheet. And the lineage that would become human beings diverged from the lineage that would become chimpanzees approximately 7 million years ago. All of that happened after the end-Permian extinction. The world of the end-Permian, with its trilobites and brachiopods and the strange dicynodonts that dominated the terrestrial fauna, is further from us in time than anything we can easily imagine. And yet the rocks that record that world are there, on every continent, accessible to anyone with a geological map and a willingness to walk to where the Permian strata are exposed. That accessibility of the deep past is one of the most remarkable features of geological science. The evidence for events that occurred hundreds of millions of years ago is preserved in the rock record, readable by people with the training to interpret it. The organisms that lived before each mass extinction are preserved as fossils that can be collected, identified, and analyzed. The chemical changes in the ocean at each extinction boundary are preserved in the isotopic composition of the carbonate rocks deposited at those times. The volcanic eruptions that caused the eruptions are preserved in the lava flows, the intrusive igneous bodies, and the ash layers that they produced. The deep past is not gone. It is preserved, in sometimes astonishing detail, in the geological and paleontological record that underlies the surface of the Earth. Learning to read that record is learning to extend the human temporal perspective far beyond the limits of historical memory or even evolutionary memory, to access directly the history of a planet that has been transforming itself for 4.5 billion years. And within that extended perspective, the 5 great mass extinctions are not disasters that happen to a world alien to our own. They are events in the continuous history of the planet that we inhabit, events that shaped the biological world we know as surely as the evolution of photosynthesis or the appearance of the first animals. The geological record of the 5 mass extinctions is preserved in outcrops on every continent, and the scientists who study them do their most important work not in laboratories but in the field, at the rock exposures where the evidence is preserved. The concept of background extinction rate, the rate at which species have gone extinct in the fossil record during intervals between the 5 great mass extinctions, is fundamental to understanding what makes a mass extinction special. The background rate, estimated from the marine invertebrate fossil record, is approximately 1 to 2 genera per million years, or roughly 1 to 2 species per million years if species diversity within genera is taken into account. That background rate reflects the normal operation of ecological competition, environmental change, and evolutionary change that produces a steady trickle of extinctions even when no catastrophic events are occurring. A mass extinction is defined as an event in which the actual extinction rate substantially exceeds that background rate for a geologically brief interval, producing a net loss of diversity that cannot be explained by the normal mechanisms of ecological and evolutionary change. The Permian-Triassic boundary is exposed in several locations around the world, but the most complete and most studied section is in the Meishan Quarry in Zhejiang Province, China, where a sequence of carbonate rocks records the transition from the Permian to the Triassic in extraordinary detail. The Meishan section has been studied for decades by teams of researchers from China, the United States, Europe, and elsewhere, and it has become the global boundary stratotype section and point for the Permian-Triassic boundary, meaning that it is the internationally agreed reference section against which all other Permian-Triassic boundary sections are correlated. The carbon isotope record from Meishan shows a dramatic negative excursion at the boundary, reflecting the collapse of marine biological productivity that accompanied the end-Permian extinction, and the associated sediment records the transition from diverse Permian marine communities to the depauperate disaster fauna of the earliest Triassic in a sequence of beds only a few centimeters thick. The Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary is exposed at hundreds of locations around the world, including the original section at Gubbio in Italy where the iridium anomaly was first discovered. Those boundary sections share a common character: a thin layer of clay, usually a centimeter or less in thickness, separating the Cretaceous sediments below from the Paleogene sediments above. In the Cretaceous sediments below the boundary, the microfossils are diverse and abundant, reflecting the productive marine ecosystems of the latest Cretaceous. In the Paleogene sediments above the boundary, the diversity collapses dramatically to a small number of survivor species. And in the clay layer itself, the iridium anomaly, the shocked quartz grains, and the tiny glass spherules produced by the impact event provide the physical evidence of the catastrophe that caused the transition. The paleontological community's ability to reconstruct the selectivity of mass extinctions, to determine which organisms were most vulnerable and which were most resilient, has been transformed by the development of quantitative methods for analyzing large fossil databases. The Paleobiology Database, a publicly available online database containing millions of fossil occurrence records from publications spanning more than a century of paleontological research, has made it possible to conduct analyses of extinction selectivity at scales that would have been impossible with the limited data available to earlier generations of researchers. Those analyses have confirmed and quantified patterns that had been suspected from qualitative observations. That large body size, narrow geographic range, and membership in ecologically specialized groups are consistently associated with higher vulnerability across multiple mass extinction events, while small body size, wide geographic distribution, and ecological generalism are consistently associated with higher survival probability. The fieldwork required to study those boundary sections is often done in remote and physically demanding locations. The Permian-Triassic sections of the Dolomites in northern Italy, where the boundary is exposed in dramatic cliff faces above alpine valleys, require technical climbing skills to access. The late Devonian sections of the Canning Basin in Western Australia are exposed in the Kimberley region, accessible only by four-wheel drive across hundreds of kilometers of unpaved track. The end-Ordovician sections of Anticosti Island in eastern Canada require helicopter access during the brief Arctic summer when the ice allows approaching the island. The scientists who study mass extinctions are, by necessity, geologists who are as comfortable in the field as in the laboratory. The relationship between volcanic eruptions and mass extinctions is one of the most intensively studied topics in geology, because understanding that relationship has implications both for the history of life and for the future of the Earth's climate system. The large igneous provinces, the geological term for the massive volcanic events associated with the end-Permian, end-Triassic, and several other extinction events, are the products of mantle plumes, columns of abnormally hot material rising from the deep mantle that burn through the overlying lithosphere and produce vast outpourings of basaltic lava. The mechanism by which a mantle plume produces a large igneous province is not fully understood, but the scale of those events, which can cover millions of square kilometers with lava to depths of kilometers, is unlike anything in the historical record of human civilization. The carbon dioxide released by large igneous province eruptions comes from two sources: the magma itself, which contains dissolved carbon dioxide that exsolves as the magma depressurizes during eruption, and the organic-rich sediments through which the magma passes as it rises toward the surface. In the Siberian traps, the eruptions that caused the end-Permian extinction passed through the thick sequence of coal-bearing sediments of the Tunguska Basin, generating enormous quantities of carbon dioxide and methane from the thermal decomposition of the organic matter in those sediments. That thermogenic carbon, added to the volcanic carbon of the eruptions themselves, may have significantly amplified the climate impact of the Siberian traps eruption. The timescales of large igneous province eruptions, measured in hundreds of thousands to millions of years, are in an uncomfortable overlap with the timescales over which the carbon cycle can respond to perturbations. The natural processes that remove excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, primarily the chemical weathering of silicate rocks, operate on timescales of millions of years. If carbon dioxide is added to the atmosphere faster than weathering can remove it, the climate will warm until the higher temperatures accelerate weathering enough to bring the system back into balance. That feedback mechanism, which is the Earth's long-term thermostat, eventually restored the climate after each large igneous province eruption. But the tens of millions of years required for that restoration were measured in mass extinctions and evolutionary reorganizations while the planet waited for its chemistry to rebalance. The isotopic records preserved at the Permian-Triassic boundary in the Mysian section and at other boundary sections around the world encode a detailed chemical diary of the events surrounding the end-Permian extinction. The carbon isotope record shows a series of negative excursions, each representing a pulse of isotopically light carbon being added to the ocean and atmosphere, consistent with the release of carbon from the Siberian traps eruption and from the thermal decomposition of organic-rich sediments in the Tunguska Basin. The sulfur isotope record shows a dramatic shift toward values consistent with widespread anoxia and hydrogen sulfide production in the deep ocean. And the boron isotope record, which tracks the pH of ancient seawater, shows a sharp decrease in ocean pH consistent with the dissolution of large quantities of carbon dioxide in the seawater during the extinction interval. Together, those isotopic records paint a picture of a rapidly changing ocean chemistry that was lethal to the majority of marine organisms. The rate of carbon release that caused the end-Permian extinction has been estimated at approximately 2 billion tons per year over the main phase of the Siberian traps eruption. Current human emissions of carbon dioxide are approximately 40 billion tons per year, 20 times the rate that caused the worst mass extinction in the history of complex life. That comparison does not mean that a mass extinction is imminent on human timescales. The geological mass extinctions played out over thousands to millions of years, and the Earth's feedbacks will respond on similarly long timescales. But it does mean that the magnitude of the current perturbation to the carbon cycle is comparable in kind, if not yet in total amount, to the perturbations associated with mass extinctions. The mass extinctions of the geological past also illuminate the resilience of life in a way that can be genuinely comforting, if the comfort of geological perspective is the kind you are looking for. Life has survived 5 events, each of which eliminated the majority of the species on Earth. In each case, the survivors rebuilt. In each case, the biodiversity of the subsequent period eventually exceeded that of the period before the extinction, as the new lineages that arose from the survivors explored the evolutionary possibilities of a world restructured by catastrophe. Life did not need the protection of stable conditions to persist. It needed only the irreducible minimum of energy sources, of chemical resources, of physical space in which organisms could maintain themselves and reproduce. When those minimum conditions were met, even in the most degraded and chemically hostile post-extinction environments, life rebuilt. That resilience does not mean that mass extinctions are without consequences. The organisms eliminated in each extinction are gone permanently. The evolutionary experiments they represented are ended. The ecological roles they filled are left vacant for millions of years. The grief for the loss of the Permian marine world, or the late Devonian fish fauna, or the magnificent non-avian dinosaurs, is entirely appropriate, even if the feeling is directed toward creatures that disappeared tens of millions of years before any human being existed to grieve them. Loss is loss, regardless of when it occurred. But the resilience of the survivors is also a fact, and it is a fact that speaks to something fundamental about the nature of life, that it does not require perfection to persist, that it does not require the maintenance of existing ecological structures to continue its evolutionary project, that the most catastrophic disruptions it has ever faced have been followed by diversifications that were in some ways richer and more creative than what preceded them. Life is not fragile in the way that individual organisms are fragile. It is robust in ways that individual organisms are not, because its robustness is distributed across billions of individuals in thousands of lineages, each one a potential seed of recovery if conditions become favorable again. The recovery of marine ecosystems after the end-Permian extinction involved not just the diversification of surviving lineages, but also the emergence of entirely new ecological structures that had not existed before the extinction. The Mesozoic Marine Revolution, a term coined by paleontologist Gerard Vermage, refers to the dramatic increase in the intensity of predation, crushing, and drilling behaviors in marine ecosystems that occurred during the Triassic and Jurassic following the extinction. New groups of predators, including the first modern sharks, the first teleost fish, and the first marine reptiles, evolved after the extinction and imposed selection pressures on the prey organisms that had not existed before. Those selection pressures drove the evolution of stronger shells, deeper burrowing behaviors, and more sophisticated escape responses in the prey, producing an escalating arms race between predators and prey that transformed the character of marine ecosystems over the course of the Mesozoic. The Mesozoic Marine Revolution was a direct consequence of the evolutionary opportunities created by the end-Permian extinction, and it produced the marine ecosystem structure that persists, in modified form, in the modern ocean. The 5 mass extinctions tell that story 5 times over, each time in a different geological setting, with different organisms, different mechanisms, and different survivors. And each time the story ends the same way, with life rebuilding, diversifying, and eventually producing a world more complex and more varied than the one that was lost. The mass extinctions also have a deeply personal dimension that is easy to overlook in the contemplation of geological timescales. The fossil embryos of Triassic marine reptiles, discovered in exceptionally well-preserved Lagerstätten, the German geological term for sites of extraordinary fossil preservation, provide an intimate window into the biology of organisms that were eliminated by the end-Triassic extinction. The ichthyosaurs, dolphin-like marine reptiles that dominated the Triassic oceans and that bore live young rather than laying eggs, are known from specimens in which the outlines of embryos are preserved within the body cavity of the mother. Those specimens demonstrate that the ichthyosaurs had already evolved a sophisticated reproduction mode that would have required generations of evolutionary refinement, and they make the subsequent elimination of the ichthyosaurs in the Jurassic, long after the end-Triassic extinction, all the more poignant. Every human being alive today is the descendant of an unbroken line of organisms that survived all 5 of the great mass extinctions. That line extends back through the mammals that survived the end-Cretaceous extinction, through the small insectivore-like synapsids that survived the end-Permian, through the fish that survived the late Devonian, through the marine invertebrates that survived the end-Ordovician. Every organism in that line survived something that killed the vast majority of its contemporaries. Every one of them found food, found shelter, reproduced, and passed their genetic inheritance to the next generation across 5 catastrophes that lasted, in some cases, tens of millions of years. That lineage is not abstract. It is encoded in the DNA of every cell of every human being, in the molecular sequences that preserve the evolutionary history of the lineage back through the Cambrian and beyond. The adaptations that allowed those ancestors to survive the mass extinctions are, in modified and updated forms, still present in the human genome. The metabolic flexibility, the broad dietary tolerance, the small body size that allowed rapid reproduction, the behavioral flexibility that enabled responses to changing conditions. Human beings are not survivors of the mass extinctions in any direct experiential sense, but they are, in a molecular and evolutionary sense, the heirs of 5 billion years of survival against catastrophic odds. Thinking about that lineage is a way of understanding the deep continuity of life that connects the present to the most distant past. The organisms that survived the end-Permian extinction were not our ancestors in the sense of being genetically identical to us or even closely related to us in the way that our recent relatives are. But they were part of the continuous chain of life that connects the first organisms on Earth to every organism alive today, and they were the specific links in that chain that carried the vertebrate lineage through the worst biological catastrophe in the history of complex life. Without them, there would be no fish, no amphibians, no reptiles, no mammals, no primates, no us. That connection between the extinction events of the deep past and the existence of the organisms living today is one of the most profound insights that paleontology has to offer. That we are not separate from the history of life on Earth but are its current expression, that the evolutionary project that began in the oceans of the early Archean and that survived every disruption the Earth has thrown at it is still ongoing, in us and in every other organism on the planet. The 5 mass extinctions are part of our story, not as events that happened to someone else long ago, but as the defining challenges that shaped the lineage that eventually produced us. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, the geological record of the 5 mass extinctions is lying quietly beneath the surface of the Earth, waiting for the next person to ask the right questions. The sediments of the Permian-Triassic boundary at Mytion are still there, their carbon isotopes still recording the catastrophic disruption of the ocean 252 million years ago. The iridium-rich clay at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary is still there, on every continent, its anomalous chemistry still testifying to the impact of an asteroid that ended the age of the non-avian dinosaurs. The trilobite-rich Cambrian and Ordovician limestones that grade upward into the impoverished disaster fauna of the earliest Silurian are still there, exposed in quarries and cliffs and riverbeds around the world. And the organisms that descended from the survivors of those events are alive, in every ecosystem on every continent and in every ocean, carrying in their bodies the evolutionary legacy of 5 near-total catastrophes. The perspective that the 5 mass extinctions offer on the current moment is one of the most important things that the history of life can give us. Not reassurance, exactly. The organisms that went extinct in each event did not come back, and the lineages lost were gone permanently. But context. The knowledge that life has faced disruptions of this magnitude before, that it has rebuilt after each one, and that the rebuilding has always eventually produced a world of greater complexity and diversity than the world that was lost. That context does not make the current extinction crisis less urgent or less morally serious. But it does situate it within a history that is larger than any single event, a history whose fundamental trajectory has always been toward more life, more variety, more evolutionary experiment. The paleogeography of the end-Permian world, in which the supercontinent Pangaea was still largely intact and surrounded by a single global ocean called Panthalassa, played an important role in the character of the extinction. The continental configuration meant that the interior of Pangaea was exposed to an extreme continental climate, far from any moderating oceanic influence, and the warming caused by the Siberian Traps eruption was particularly severe in those continental interiors. The single global ocean of Panthalassa had a different circulation pattern from the multi-ocean world of the Mesozoic and Cenozoic, and the anoxia that developed in the Permian Ocean may have been more extensive and more persistent than it would have been in a more fragmented ocean system. The specific paleogeographic configuration of the Permian world, in other words, may have amplified the severity of the extinction beyond what the volcanic forcing alone would have produced. The fossil lagerstätten that preserve exceptional soft tissue detail from periods immediately before and after mass extinctions have provided some of the most emotionally powerful evidence about the character of those events. The Solnhofen limestone of Bavaria, which preserves the feather impressions of the earliest birds, including the famous Archaeopteryx, dates from the late Jurassic, a period of recovery and diversification following the end-Triassic extinction. The Burgess Shale of British Columbia, which preserves the soft-bodied fauna of the Middle Cambrian in extraordinary detail, dates from the period of the Cambrian explosion that followed the end of the Ediacaran and the Cambrian-Ordovician transition. And the exceptionally preserved faunus of the Ediacaran period itself, preserved in oxygen-poor sediments that prevented decay, document the biota immediately before the Cambrian explosion and the evolutionary experiments of the Ediacaran period that were replaced by the modern animal body plans in the early Cambrian. Sleep now, knowing that you exist because of 5 catastrophes that nearly ended everything. Knowing that the life around you, the trees outside your window and the microbes in your gut and the insects you hear on summer evenings, is the descendant of organisms that survived conditions that killed the majority of their kind. And knowing that whatever happens next in the history of life on this planet, the evolutionary project that has been underway for 4 billion years will continue, building new forms and new possibilities from whatever raw material remains, as it has always done, as it has always found a way to do. That is the ultimate lesson of the 5 mass extinctions. Not that life is fragile, but that it is tenacious beyond any reasonable expectation, that it rebuilds from whatever survives, and that the rebuilding is always, eventually, worth contemplating. The question of what caused the late Devonian extinction is made more complex by the fact that it was not a single event but a series of extinction pulses spread over approximately 20 million years. The 2 most severe pulses, known as the Kellwasser events after the location in Germany where they were first identified, occurred approximately 372 and 359 million years ago. Those events eliminated different components of the Devonian marine fauna. The first Kellwasser event particularly affected reef-building organisms, including stromatoporoids and tabulate corals, while the second was more severe for open-water organisms, including many fish groups. The extended and multi-pulsed character of the late Devonian extinction may reflect the extended duration of the environmental changes driving it, the progressive drawdown of carbon dioxide by the first forests, rather than a single catastrophic forcing event. The survivors of the end-Cretaceous extinction that diversified most rapidly and most spectacularly in the Paleogene were not always the groups that had been most successful in the Cretaceous. The mammals, which had been a relatively minor component of Mesozoic terrestrial ecosystems, diversified explosively into the ecological roles vacated by the non-avian dinosaurs. The teleost fish, which had been one of many groups in Cretaceous marine ecosystems, diversified after the extinction into the dominant group of vertebrates in the modern ocean, producing more species than all other vertebrate groups combined. And the angiosperms, the flowering plants that had diversified during the Cretaceous but that had not yet achieved ecological dominance in most terrestrial ecosystems, diversified explosively in the Paleogene into the dominant plant group of modern terrestrial ecosystems. The post-Cretaceous world was, in fundamental ways, the world of the survivors, of the mammals, the teleost fish, and the flowering plants. The geological timescale itself is organized around the mass extinction events, with each of the major geological boundaries corresponding to one of the 5 great extinctions. The boundary between the Paleozoic and Mesozoic eras is defined by the end-Permian extinction, the most severe event in the history of complex life. The boundary between the Mesozoic and Cenozoic eras is defined by the end-Cretaceous extinction. And within those eras, the period boundaries are defined by smaller but still significant extinction events and evolutionary transitions. The organization of geological time around biological events reflects the recognition that the most meaningful divisions of Earth history are not defined by changes in the rocks themselves, but by changes in the life those rocks record, the periodization of time by biology rather than by stratigraphy. The concept of evolutionary dead ends, lineages that specialized so completely for the conditions of the pre-extinction world that they were unable to survive the changed conditions of the post-extinction world, is illustrated by several of the most spectacular casualties of the 5 mass extinctions. The plesiosaurs and mosasaurs of the Cretaceous Ocean, large marine reptiles that had diversified into the apex predator roles of the Mesozoic seas, were eliminated by the end-Cretaceous extinction along with the non-avian dinosaurs. Those organisms had evolved over millions of years into highly specialized ecological niches that depended on the specific structure of the Cretaceous ecosystem. When that ecosystem was dismantled by the impact winter, the organisms whose biology was most tightly integrated with its structure were the least capable of surviving the disruption. The generalists and the ecologically flexible survived. The specialists were eliminated. The deep time perspective offered by the 5 mass extinctions is also a perspective on the future of life on Earth. The geological record shows that life has survived conditions far more extreme than anything the current climate crisis is likely to produce on human timescales, and that each major disruption has been followed by a recovery and a diversification that produced a biologically richer world than the one that preceded the disruption. But those recoveries took millions of years. The organisms that were eliminated during the recoveries did not participate in the rebuilding, and the evolutionary directions taken by the survivors were not predictable from the state of the world before the extinction. The recovery produced something genuinely new, not a restoration of what had been lost. Understanding that dynamic is essential for thinking clearly about the current extinction crisis. What is at stake is not just the number of species on Earth, but the specific evolutionary experiments those species represent, experiments that took hundreds of millions of years to produce and that cannot be replaced on any timescale relevant to human civilization. The role of ocean circulation in modulating the effects of mass extinctions is a topic that oceanographers and paleoclimatologists have studied with increasing sophistication using both the geological record and climate models. The circulation of the ocean, driven by the density differences between warm, fresh surface water and cold, salty deep water, plays a crucial role in distributing heat from the tropics to the poles and in supplying oxygen to the deep ocean. When that circulation is disrupted, as it can be by rapid changes in temperature or in the freshwater balance of the surface ocean, the deep ocean can become anoxic on timescales of decades to centuries. The development of widespread anoxia in the deep ocean is one of the most consistent features of the mass extinction events associated with warming, and understanding how circulation changes lead to anoxia requires the kind of interdisciplinary research that brings together paleontology, geochemistry, and physical oceanography. The recovery of terrestrial ecosystems after the end-Cretaceous extinction was mediated to a significant degree by the survival of flowering plants, which had diversified during the Cretaceous and whose seeds and underground structures were resistant enough to survive the impact winter. The darkness and cold of the impact winter eliminated most photosynthesis for months to years, but the seeds and root systems of flowering plants survived in dormancy, ready to germinate and grow when the sunlight returned. That rapid recovery of plant productivity was essential for the survival of the animals that fed on plants, and it provided the ecological foundation for the mammalian diversification of the Paleogene. The recovery of terrestrial ecosystems after the end-Cretaceous extinction was therefore faster than after the end-Permian, in part because the flowering plants that dominated those ecosystems were physiologically and ecologically more resilient than the organisms that had dominated Permian terrestrial ecosystems. The fossil record of insects, which is relatively sparse compared with the record of marine invertebrates because insect exoskeletons are less resistant to decay than calcium carbonate shells, nevertheless shows clear signals of mass extinction events in the most severe events. Insects survived all 5 of the great mass extinctions, though with significant reductions in diversity in some events. Their high reproductive rates, small body sizes, and ecological flexibility make them among the most resilient groups in the history of life, and their recovery from extinction events has typically been rapid. The surviving insect lineages diversified explosively in the post-extinction environments, producing many of the most ecologically important insect groups in the modern world, including the bees, the ants, and the beetles, which together account for a substantial fraction of all known animal species. The philosophical dimensions of the mass extinction story extend to questions about the nature of progress in evolution. The history of life is sometimes portrayed as a trajectory of increasing complexity and sophistication, from simple bacteria to complex multicellular organisms to the extraordinary diversity of the modern biosphere. The mass extinctions challenge that narrative of progressive evolution by demonstrating that the most complex and most successful organisms of any given period are precisely those most likely to be eliminated when the conditions of that period change. Progress, in the evolutionary sense, is not a directed trajectory toward greater complexity but an exploration of the fitness landscape of the moment, and when that landscape changes catastrophically, the organisms most adapted to the previous landscape are the ones most likely to fall. The survivors are often the small, the simple, and the flexible, and the progress of subsequent evolution is built on their simplicity rather than on the complexity of the organisms that preceded them. The aftermath of each mass extinction produced not just new species but new ecological strategies that had not previously existed. The rise of the first true predators capable of crushing shells, the Durophagy revolution of the Mesozoic marine revolution, fundamentally changed the evolutionary arms race between predators and prey in marine ecosystems. The evolution of endothermy in birds and mammals, which allowed those organisms to maintain elevated body temperatures independent of the environment and to be active in conditions that would have immobilized ectothermic reptiles, transformed the energetics of terrestrial ecosystems in ways that made possible the complex social behaviors, the extended parental care, and the cognitive sophistication that characterize modern mammals and birds. Those ecological and physiological innovations, which emerged in the post-extinction environments created by the 5 great mass extinctions, are part of the legacy of those events. Not just the loss of what existed before, but the creation of what came after. The preservation of mass extinction signals in lake sediments, river deposits, and cave formations, environments less commonly studied than marine sediments, has recently expanded the record of mass extinction events into continental settings that were previously less well documented. The cave formations of South Africa and China contain pollen records that show dramatic changes in vegetation at the Permian-Triassic and Cretaceous-Paleogene boundaries, tracking the collapse of terrestrial plant communities at those times. The river deposits of the American West show the transition from dinosaur-dominated to mammal-dominated faunas across the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary in a level of detail that is impossible to achieve from marine sediments alone. And the lake sediments of East Africa contain pollen and leaf records that document the ecological changes associated with major climatic events of the Cenozoic that, while not mass extinctions in the geological sense, were significant disruptions to the terrestrial ecosystems of the time. The study of mass extinctions has also contributed to the development of conservation biology as a scientific discipline. The recognition that mass extinctions are characterized by specific patterns of selectivity, that large body size, narrow geographic range, and specialized ecology are consistently associated with elevated extinction risk, has provided a theoretical framework for identifying the species most at risk in the current extinction crisis and prioritizing conservation resources accordingly. The species most likely to go extinct in the current period are precisely those that the geological record identifies as the most vulnerable in past mass extinctions, and the conservation strategies most likely to prevent those extinctions are those that address the specific vulnerabilities. Protecting habitat to allow geographic range expansion, reducing overexploitation to prevent population collapses, and managing invasive species to restore ecological interactions disrupted by Introductions. The international collaboration required to understand the 5 mass extinctions has produced scientific communities that span institutional and national boundaries in unusual ways. The Permian-Triassic boundary section at Meishan in China is studied by researchers from more than 20 countries, with different national groups contributing expertise in geochemistry, paleontology, stratigraphy, and climate modeling. The Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary has been studied at hundreds of locations by thousands of researchers, with the results compiled into databases that allow global analyses impossible for any single research group. The late Devonian extinction is studied through an international consortium that coordinates fieldwork across North America, Europe, Asia, and Australia. That international collaboration is itself a legacy of the scientific importance of understanding mass extinctions. Questions that transcend the geological records of any single country require answers that transcend the scientific communities of any single country. The detection of mass extinction signals in the sedimentary record is a skill that requires years of training and experience to develop, because the geological record is not a clean archive but a complex, partially preserved, and often disturbed sequence of sediments that must be interpreted with caution. The apparent suddenness of a mass extinction in the fossil record may reflect the actual rapidity of the extinction, but it may also reflect a gap in the fossil record caused by erosion or non-deposition of sediments during a period when the environment was too harsh to preserve fossils. Distinguishing between those possibilities requires the analysis of multiple sections from different geographic locations, the use of multiple stratigraphic markers to constrain the age of the boundary, and the development of geochemical proxies that can detect environmental changes even in the absence of biological remains. That methodological sophistication, which has developed dramatically over the last 30 years, has transformed the study of mass extinctions from a qualitative to a quantitative science. The mass extinctions also provide a framework for understanding the history of evolutionary innovation. The 5 great extinctions were followed by 5 great diversifications, each of which produced the characteristic fauna and flora of the subsequent geological period. But the innovations that emerged in those diversifications were not predictable from the state of life before the extinction. They represented genuinely new possibilities that were opened by the ecological opportunities created when the dominant organisms of the pre-extinction world were eliminated. The end-Permian extinction, for example, cleared the way for the diversification of the archosaurs, the group that gave rise to the dinosaurs, the pterosaurs, and the crocodilians, none of which had been significant components of the Permian terrestrial fauna. Without the Great Dying, there might have been no dinosaurs, no birds, and no mammals. The 5 extinctions were not just catastrophes. They were, from the perspective of the subsequent history of life, the necessary conditions for the world we know. The taphonomy of mass extinction boundaries, the study of how organisms are preserved or not preserved in the sedimentary record at those boundaries, reveals important information about the conditions that existed during the extinction events. In the immediate aftermath of mass extinctions, the bioturbation of sediments by burrowing organisms, which normally mixes the uppermost layers of seafloor sediment and destroys fine-scale sedimentary structures, ceases or is greatly reduced because the burrowing organisms themselves have been eliminated. That reduction in bioturbation preserves laminated sediments, thin layers of sediment deposited under anoxic conditions that would normally be destroyed by bioturbation. Those laminated sediments are among the most direct evidence for the anoxic conditions that characterize the oceans during the worst phases of the mass extinctions, and their presence at mass extinction boundaries is one of the most consistent features of those boundaries in the geological record. The emotional dimension of studying mass extinctions is something that paleontologists rarely discuss in their scientific publications, but that shapes their relationship to their work in ways that are difficult to articulate. The act of collecting a trilobite fossil, holding in your hand an organism that lived 400 million years ago and that belongs to a group eliminated by the end-Permian extinction, is an experience that carries a weight that is not purely scientific. The trilobite in your hand represents an evolutionary lineage that persisted for 300 million years, that survived 2 of the 5 great mass extinctions, and that was finally eliminated by the 3rd. The fossil is not just data. It is a remnant of something that is gone, permanently and completely, and the completeness of that loss is part of what motivates the scientific work of understanding how and why it happened. That emotional dimension does not compromise the science. It deepens it, giving the questions a resonance that pure intellectual curiosity alone cannot provide. The end-Permian extinction also had profound effects on the chemistry of the atmosphere that persist in the geological record as changes in the isotopic composition of sulfur compounds in marine sediments. The widespread anoxia of the Permian Ocean allowed sulfate-reducing bacteria to produce hydrogen sulfide in quantities large enough to create what researchers have called a euxinic ocean, an ocean poisoned by hydrogen sulfide at depths where oxygen was absent. That hydrogen sulfide may have been vented into the atmosphere in quantities sufficient to damage the ozone layer, allowing elevated levels of ultraviolet radiation to reach the surface and contributing to the extinction of terrestrial organisms. The coincidence of ocean anoxia, hydrogen sulfide poisoning, greenhouse warming, and ultraviolet radiation damage created a multi-stressor environment that was lethal to organisms across all marine and terrestrial habitats simultaneously, explaining the extraordinary thoroughness of the end-Permian extinction in a way that no single stressor could account for on its own. The geological record of the 5 mass extinctions will continue to be refined as new analytical techniques are developed and as previously inaccessible sections are opened to study. The use of laser ablation inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry to measure trace element concentrations at the sub-millimeter scale in carbonate rocks is revealing chemical variations at mass extinction boundaries that were previously invisible. The development of non-traditional stable isotope systems, including those based on calcium, magnesium, and zinc, is providing new proxies for ancient ocean chemistry that complement the established carbon, oxygen, and sulfur isotope systems. And the increasing accessibility of remote field locations through improved logistics and satellite imagery is making it possible to study mass extinction boundaries in regions, including parts of Antarctica, Central Asia, and the deep ocean floor, that were previously too difficult or too expensive to reach. Each advance in analytical capability and field accessibility adds new dimensions to the understanding of events that are already among the most studied in the history of geological science. The 5 apocalypses are not just stories from the geological past. They are the 5 moments when the question of whether life would continue on Earth was genuinely open, when the answer was uncertain, when the outcome depended on the survival of organisms whose existence was accidental and whose resilience was untested. 5 times, life found an answer to that question. 5 times, the answer was yes. And 5 times, the yes that followed was stranger and richer than the world that had preceded the catastrophe. That pattern, of catastrophe followed by recovery, of loss followed by new possibility, is the deepest pattern in the history of life on this planet. It does not predict a future. It does not guarantee a recovery from the current extinction crisis on any timescale relevant to our civilization. But it demonstrates that life as a process is more durable than any individual form of it, and that durability is worth knowing about on any night when the weight of the world seems to make sleep difficult. The language we use to describe mass extinctions shapes how we think about them. Words like catastrophe, disaster, and apocalypse carry emotional weight that is appropriate to the scale of the events, but that can also obscure their geological character. A mass extinction is not a disaster in the human sense of a sudden, unexpected calamity. It is a disruption to the Earth's biological systems that operates on timescales of thousands to millions of years, and that is, by the standards of geological history, a relatively common occurrence. Understanding mass extinctions requires holding in mind both their catastrophic character from the perspective of the organisms that experience them and their relatively ordinary character from the perspective of the geological timescale on which the history of life operates. The sounds of the world that existed before each mass extinction are permanently lost. We can know from the fossil record that the Ordovician seas were filled with the clicking of trilobites and the filter-feeding movements of brachiopods. We can infer that the Permian forests were filled with the sounds of the dicynodonts and the archosaurs moving through the vegetation. We can reconstruct, with some precision, the calls that the non-avian dinosaurs might have made based on the structure of their vocal anatomy. But we cannot hear any of it. The acoustic world of the past, which was as rich and as varied as the acoustic world of the present, is completely inaccessible to us, and the silence of the geological record is a different kind of loss from the loss of the fossils themselves. The mass extinction silenced not just the organisms but the worlds those organisms inhabited, and those worlds are gone in a completeness that makes the fossil record, for all its richness, feel like a very partial record indeed. If this documentary kept you company tonight, subscribe to the channel. There are more worlds to explore, more extinctions and more recoveries, more catastrophes and more impossibilities survived. A new one every week, always in the dark, always patient, always continuing.